Hello, everybody, and welcome to Knowledge is Power Podcast Live. We're here on the Sunday of April the 16th, 2023. And it's been a while since we've been on here, and I had ordered new equipment, and so we're back on live every Sunday. So don't forget on Thursday, Roundtable Talk with Chris Jones as your host. Tonight, I got a great guest tonight. Tonight, that we're gonna have a tribute to one of our great pioneer civil rights leaders, Attorney Elmo Willard III. Um, his son, Dr. David Willard, is our guest tonight, and we're going to have some great conversation about the time of desegregation, segregation, civil rights, Jim Crow era, and the time living in Beaumont, Texas. Knowledge is Power Podcast Live is a platform to share important information by educating the Southeast Texas African American community with viable information on health, education, financial, politics, and business. We try to cover it all. Knowledge is Power Podcast Live also is now on Facebook, Spotify, Instagram, YouTube, LinkedIn, Twitter, Apple iTunes, Amazon Music, LinkedIn, and Google Play. Now, as for ado, let me introduce you to our guest tonight, Dr. David Willard. Hello, Dave.
Hey, Tony. How you doing, man?
I'm
Hello to
great,
the
man.
audience.
I am great, man. It's great to have you on as my guest tonight. And those who are listening and watching, you like to ask Dr. Willard any questions, there's a link on the side, a comment that you can place that comment, and we will see that comment, and we will add, and Dr. Willard will address that and answer your questions about our topic tonight. Our topic is a tribute to the great pioneer civil rights attorney Elmo Willard III, a community leader in Beaumont and surrounding Southeast Texas. And he was here for us for justice. Dave, you know, you and I are probably living in the last living generation of the deep South Jim Crow era where we witnessed desegregation.
Yes.
And I was just thinking as I was getting ready to put this show together, is that do you know that I was born the year that Emmett Till was killed?
Wow. Wow. No, I didn't know that.
Yeah, I just going to my stance and wow, man, that's been 67 years ago.
Wow.
And
Yeah,
we're
that's
still, yeah, and we're still having issues and problems in today's life. So, with due respect, I like to, and everybody, again, I like to introduce Dr. David Willard, who parents was the Elmo and Patricia Willard, Beaumont, Texas.
yep.
And Dave, tell us a little bit about in the beginning the Willard family when it moved to Beaumont in the early 1900s.
Yes. So I want to say thank you to you, Tony, and thank you to your audience for having me on this evening. I really appreciate it. I love speaking about my family and speaking about the contributions that they've made here to Jefferson County and to Beaumont in particular. So I really appreciate your taking some time out tonight and hope that this is some information that the audience will appreciate and will maybe learn a few things from. And so you're right. I need to, we're going to talk, I think, eventually about my dad. But the first thing that I think people need to understand is that my father is a product of his upbringing. He's a product of his family, and as am I. But my ancestors before me contributed a lot to Beaumont even before my father was born, even before he was thought of and conceived of. I'm going to do a little show and tell for you guys here. I got a couple of things I want to show, and I don't know if people will be able to see this or not, but the document that I'm holding up in front of my face right now, a friend of mine found this down at the Jefferson County Courthouse, and that's how the Willard family began. That is the marriage license between Riley Willard and Margaret Runnels here in Beaumont, and it was 1 year after slavery was abolished in the state of Texas, 1 year after Juneteenth here in the state of Texas. They were both slaves here in Beaumont, Texas. They got married, and that's how the Willard family began right here in Beaumont. So the Willard family has been here in Beaumont, Texas, since there was a Beaumont, Texas. And um, out of that union, they had 8 children out of that union. A few of them died and didn't make it to adulthood. but Elmo R. Willard the first, the R standing for Riley, his dad's name, was the first Elmo Willard in the family. He was the eldest of his brothers, surviving brothers and sisters, and he came out of slavery and began to sort of take care of his brothers and sisters and make a mark for himself here in Beaumont. And he did that quite well, as a matter of fact. He worked at the lumber company, got a job at the lumber company, worked odds and ends jobs here in Beaumont. He raced horses, and from what I understand, was victorious and was a good horseman for a while. And then he took up the trade of barbering, which for people newly freed, coming out of something like slavery, was a good trade to have because, it's almost like it's almost like the funeral home business, which my family got into also. People gonna always die. People gonna always need a haircut. People gonna always need those kind of services. And because black people had to do for themselves, that was a really good trade for him. Became very successful at that. Became very well known here in the Beaumont area, in the surrounding area, in Beaumont surrounding area, for his work ethic and his ability to get along with all sides of everyone, black and white, here in Beaumont. Um, I have another document here that I'm going to show. I'll show a picture of Elmo Willard the first, and this is hanging up in the house that I'm living in now. This is Elmo R. Willard the first. He is my great grandfather, and he is the grandfather of Elmo R. Willard the third, my dad. He became, like I said, very well known here in Beaumont. He built the first brick home in Beaumont, Texas, by an African American, which is where I'm talking to you from tonight. It's on Gladys Street, right next door to Mercy Funeral Home. It's a two-story red brick building. It's been in existence for basically about 100 years now. That's where the Willard family, it was the main homestead of the Willard family, even though that there were two other homesteads not too far from here over on Concord Street as well. Um, and it became sort of a landmark for African Americans in this area. For someone to have come out of slavery and not too shortly after slavery to be able to build a two-story brick home was something that the community, the African American community as a whole, celebrated. I heard stories growing up as a kid that people actually used to pack lunches and uh, sit out across the street and watch while the house was going up and while it was being built, because it was a house for the Willard family, but it was also seen as a real move forward for the African American community here in Beaumont. He was so well thought of that he even was allowed to sit on juries here in Beaumont, Texas, which is something that, if you know your history and you study your history, African Americans were not allowed to sit in any sort of criminal or civil court proceeding that might have white defendants involved in that case. But he was so well respected and became so well respected that he actually could sit on juries. I have another document that is from the Southeast Texas State Fair in 1936, and he and his brothers and a nephew he himself, Elmo R. Willard the first, was profiled in this document that's called it says the Negro Department of the Southeast Texas State Fair, and he's got the date on it. And I have the original document. This is a Xerox. But they ended up profiling him in this document and talking about his industriousness and his hard work, and how he was respected by all people here in Beaumont, and how he and his brothers, along with several other pioneering black families here in Beaumont, the Sprout family, the Wallace family, the Price family, and several other the older families here, black families here in Beaumont, put together a Negro exhibit hall in 1936 to showcase the accomplishments of African Americans throughout the nation, throughout the United States. They banded together, they pooled their resources together, put their money together, and actually created this exhibit hall that black people and white people could visit. I don't know how many white people visited, but on Negro Day, at the state fair, because we could only go out there one day when the fair was here, could go in and learn about the accomplishments of African Americans. And this was 10 years after Carter G. Woodson, who had started Negro History Week. He started that in 1926. So in 1936, Elmo R. Willard I, his brother Joseph Willard, his nephew P.H. Willard, and several others, the Wallace family, the Price family, Sprott family, a lot of others were on this committee to sort of put this together. So, so he did a lot. He did a lot. He established the Elmo Willard Addition, which was the housing addition in this neighborhood here on Gladys Street. He put up homes for African Americans to be able to purchase their own home and reside in. They were both rental properties and properties that they could eventually buy. And that was in this area on Evelyn Street, on Gladys Street, and the surrounding area here in the North End. So he was quite a man. I'm still, amazed at what he was able to accomplish being an African American and coming out of slavery during his time. He did a lot. And then not only that, but he married Sarah Adams. And Sarah Adams was the daughter of Elijah Adams. And for some of your older members who might be watching this broadcast, Elijah Adams was one of the early Black educators here in Beaumont. And Adams Elementary was actually named after him. And Adams Elementary, some form or fashion of that school stood here in Beaumont up until 2019 when they tore down the last remaining building for Adams Elementary in 2019. I think it was the summer of 2019. And so Sarah Adams was Elijah Adams' daughter. And my great grandfather, Elmo Willard I, married Sarah Adams. So on both my dad's maternal and paternal sides, he had people that he could look up to, people who were trying to do something for African Americans. They were trying to better their own lives, but also were trying to better the lives of African Americans in general in this area. And they managed to do quite a bit. His father and his uncle, my dad's father and uncle, created Willard and Willard ambulance service here in Beaumont. And I'm going to show this document right quick also. Here is an ad from the Charlton Pollard yearbook. It was called Willard's Benefit Funeral Association. It was Willard and Willard Incorporated, and it was the first funeral home business and mortuary business and ambulance service business here in Beaumont for African Americans. Because even back in that day and time, white people would not bury African Americans. They had nothing to do with Black people at all, not alive or dead. So we had to take care of our own.
Right.
So my grandfather and his brother decided that they would step into the fold and sort of take care of that. And here's a picture of my grandfather here. Like I said, I'm doing a little show and tell here tonight.
That's okay. Hey, we need to know history because you know what? I thought I knew it all, but I'm learning something tonight.
There's a lot, and I'm seriously amazed at how much they were able to do and what
right back in that time in that era. Yeah, I mean it's amazing that they Willard and Willard Funeral Home, which was on Forsyth Street, correct?
Exactly, it was on Forsyth Street, right there in the heart of one of the business districts here in Beaumont for African Americans at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And it stood all the way up until around, I'm going to say that business continued to operate up until about 1965. I think that's when my father closed it down. He moved back here to Beaumont from law school. My grandfather had passed away, and the business was still ongoing at that time. And my father was trying to set up his law practice and also run the funeral home business at the same time. And surprisingly, William Taft, my wife's grandfather, who started Mercy Funeral Home, actually worked at Willard and Willard. It's where he learned the funeral home business. And he worked under my grandfather and my great uncle, and he worked with my dad to try to keep the Willard and Willard funeral home business going. And
Wow.
then when they shut it down, he went off and actually a little before my dad shut it down, Mr. Taft went off and bought Mercy, and Mercy is now the oldest running African American mortuary business here in Beaumont. So
Wow.
so
Wow.
a lot of people are connected here in Beaumont. There are a lot of African American families, some of the older ones that are connected, and you know, and the thing I've learned about this in studying this, because I was raised on it and was taught a lot of this, but I've learned a lot more since I've moved back here to Beaumont, is that there was a sense of connectedness in the African American community that I'm not sure is still there today. The families realized that they were up against it, and there was a lot that they needed to overcome. And so those that could banded together and tried to work for the benefit of improving their own families and making it good for their own families, but also keeping in mind how they could improve those in the African American community who were maybe less well off than they were,
Mhm.
trying to pull everyone together at the same time as they were trying to move in better things for themselves also. And that to me is a simply is an amazing thing because it was rough going back then, man. It was
Yes.
life or death. I mean, it could be life or death. I mean, it's life or death now a lot in a lot of instances, but back then it was wild times. So for them to kind of band together like that and realize that we're in all this together and let's try to help each other out. That's something that I think younger generations can learn from and try to use today. So
Yes. So
yeah,
your dad went off to school. Went
he
off to
did.
college. He went to Frisk. Did he?
He did. He's a product of Charlton Pollard High School, and
Hmm.
graduated from Pollard High School in 1947. He went off to Fisk, and he didn't go off to Fisk alone. I've kind of told this story before, but
Tell me the story. I didn't hear this story.
so the fathers back in that day and time, they actually held a meeting um, deciding where their kids were going to go to college. And they were going to send them in mass to wherever they decided from this meeting as to where they were going to go off to school. And at the time, Fisk was one of the best, black colleges in the United States of America, one of the best colleges, period, in the country, and was certainly one of the top colleges for African Americans at the time. And so there were a group of them that kind of got together, fathers got together and said, well, we're going to send these boys off to Fisk. W.B. Du Bois, Fisk University, you had the Jubilee Singers, you had all kinds of renowned African American educators who were coming out of Fisk and were working at Fisk. And so that's how my father actually ended up at Fisk University. And he went off there in 1947. Saul White, who you might know of, and White's pharmacy building down there on Forsyth Street.
Right.
He and my father, Saul White Jr., he and my father were best friends. And they went off to Fisk together along with Perry Coleman, who became a barber here in
Right. Right.
Beaumont. Perry Coleman and Duhan's Barbershop here on Glen.
Right. Right.
Um, and about two or three others all went off to Fisk together. I think there was like five or six of them from Beaumont that went off to Fisk together, and and that's how they got there. And so yeah, he went off to Fisk in Nashville, Tennessee, in 1947.
Wow.
Yeah,
Wow, that's great history, man. That's a
yeah.
great bio. Now, after he graduated from Fitch, he went to do his study at Howard, right?
He did at Howard Law School,
Hmm.
and just a little story for that. My dad had two great aunts, and two aunts. I'm sorry, not they were my great aunts, but two aunts. Marguerite Willard, and everybody called her Pick, and then Vieta Willard, and that whole family. There were five children who were raised in the house that I'm in now here on Gladys Street. And to tell you the foresight of my great grandfather, Elmo Willard the first, my great aunts, Aunt Pick and Aunt Vieta, actually graduated from Howard University in Washington, D.C. in 1925 and 1931, respectively.
Wow.
You think back to, I mean, there were hardly any women in the United States, white or black, who were
Wow.
receiving college educations at that time.
Right, right.
And Howard was considered to be the pinnacle of education, of higher education for African Americans back in that day and time, and even to this day. As many of your people probably know, our vice president now is a graduate of Howard University. Kamala Harris went there, along with countless other folks from the time. And my great grandfather and great grandmother had the foresight to send their daughters off to Howard University for a college education. And like I said, they graduated in 1925 and 1931, respectively, from Howard University. So this, so the the vision that my great grandfather had for his family and for the African American community here in Beaumont was unprecedented. It blows me away the more I sort of read and the more I find out about some of the stuff that he did. But anyway, when my dad graduated from Fisk, you're right. He went off to Howard University. He had met my mom at Fisk University during that time. They had gotten married, and the two of them pulled up stakes and went off to Howard University School of Law and entered there in 1951. He entered law school in 1951.
Now he has met some he's met some great individuals, black individuals while in Washington D.C. Also, he was invited to the inauguration as well, several inaugurations of our presidents.
He was, yes. Well, even in law school, my dad finished third in his class at Howard Law School. And as he says, and I found in some archives down at the Terrell Historical Library that my mom and I donated after my dad died, he had written his own sort of biography for a judgeship that he was nominated for. And it's about a 10, 12-page document. And he talked, it was the first time that I found out because my father was actually, excuse me, Tony, to tell you the truth, of all the stuff that my father did and accomplished, he really didn't talk very much about those things at all.
I know. I know. I've been in this company many times and we just sat and he never talked about all those things.
Yeah, I mean, he would talk with you and laugh and joke,
right,
drink with you. You know, he
yeah. It was very common.
He did not. He
Right.
did not talk or brag about the stuff that he was
No.
involved in and the things that he had done in his life. He just really didn't share that kind of stuff. I was his child. I was his son, and I had an older brother, and he didn't share that stuff even with us. You know, he just didn't really talk about it. But anyway, I found this document that he had written, and I first learned that, of course, everybody knows Thurgood Marshall, and people know James Neighbor, and people know the Brown versus Board of Education decision, 1954 Brown versus Board of Education decision that made desegregation, that made segregation illegal in the United States of America. Well, my father worked closely on that case, which I did not know. As he stated in this document, and I have it here before me, he said his proudest accomplishment while a student in law school was, I want to get the correct name of it. I think it was called try to, yeah, he says, my most rewarding accomplishment while a law student came when I was named chief of the student critique team to analyze and critique the briefs which were filed before the United States Supreme Court in the school desegregation case, Brown versus the Board of Education et al. And he was he worked closely with Thurgood Marshall and James Neighbor. They would come and they would argue this case before these nine selected students who were to act as sort of the Supreme Court judges. And they would review the briefs, they would review the argument that the team was putting together and try to tear it apart and try to find holes in it and find out where they might be falling short before the Supreme Court. Um, and I mean, this is one of the landmark cases in the United States of America that's ever gone before the Supreme Court, and certainly the most important case probably that's impacted African Americans in the United States of America. And here you have a man from Beaumont, right here in our grew up and raised and educated here in Beaumont, Texas, who was an active member of that case. Um, and so, yeah, so his parents and his grandparents and all the people who had accomplished things before him set him on this path, and he went off to do great things himself. So
Yeah,
yeah,
he's had met and with some escalades of what he's done. He's accomplished a lot. Before coming to Beaumont, I mean, he decided to return to Beaumont. Your
yes,
parents decided to return to Beaumont. What year was that?
he returned here in 1954.
In 1954.
Right,
Okay, so
right,
we were still in a deep Jim Crow desegregation era.
right, right.
And again, like I was telling you before the show, we started the show, is that uh, our generation, and the reason why I say you, our generation, because I remember you played on the same, you and I played on the same little league baseball team together.
Right. It's our
But
generation. Yeah,
right. We
yeah,
are the last living generation of desegregation, that we witnessed desegregation
yeah.
deeply.
Right.
Well, and we have a lot that we need to share. And this is the reason why I wanted to continue educating the African American communities everywhere,
Yeah,
everywhere, about our history, about our accomplishments, about where we come from, how we, what it took to get where we are now.
exactly.
To look back, it's not. I look at the news and I read the news, and they're trying to take us back, but we cannot go back. We got to stay forward, stay focused. So tell us what, I mean, your dad come here in 1954, started his law practice, and he also had the funeral home at the same time. So let's move on from that part.
Yep. So he comes back, and Theodore Johns, who I think everybody also knows here in Beaumont, Theodore Johns
Right.
had graduated in Howard Law School the year before my dad graduated. And he was from Silsbee, Texas, and he had
That's
moved.
right.
Once he graduated from Howard Law School, he moved here to Beaumont, moved himself and his young family here to Beaumont, and he set up a law practice. And my dad moved back in 1954. He knew Johns from law school. They reestablished their connections once he moved back home, and they decided to join together and form a law firm called Johns and Willard Law Firm. And for those who are listening, um, Howard Law School was set up for one reason and one reason only. It was set up by a man by the name of Charles Hamilton Houston, under the direction of Mordecai Johnson. Mordecai Johnson was the very first African American president of Howard University. Mordecai Johnson was a Morehouse man. He was considered one of the three best preachers, ministers, African American ministers in the United States of America, educators and ministers in the United States of America. The other two were Howard Thurman and Vernon Johns. And Vernon Johns is the man who preceded Dr. King in Montgomery, Alabama, running the church in Montgomery, Alabama, and sort of um, trained that congregation and tried to get that congregation ready for someone like Dr. King to come in and do what they did in Montgomery with the bus boycott. Well, Mordecai Johnson was on that same sort of level with Vernon Johns and with Howard Thurman in terms of respect and in terms of knowledge amongst African Americans. And he became the first African American president of Howard University. And he wanted to set up a law school. And he hired Charles Hamilton Houston to run the law school. Charles Hamilton Houston was the first African American to graduate from Harvard Law School. And his whole mission in life was to use the law to destroy segregation in the United States of America. So when he became head to set up Howard Law School, that's what the mission of Howard Law School was about, to train African American lawyers to go out across the country and to dismantle segregation by legal means. So here you had two men who had been trained in a law school whose purpose was to go back to their communities and start attacking segregation and do it through the courts. And that's exactly what my dad and what Johns started to do. They set up a law practice, came back here to Beaumont. Beaumont and all of Jefferson County was deeply segregated at that time. There was nothing that African Americans could do, nothing that they could take part in that was considered to be a part of white society. And the first case that they had was six black golfers who wanted to play at the Terrell Park golf course. Um, and this is where the interconnections between African Americans and Beaumont, this is where it really starts to kind of come together. So there was a man by the name of Booker Faison, and he was a real estate and insurance man here in Beaumont, African American man. And my dad and John's rented their law offices from Mr. Faison. He had several properties on Washington Boulevard, several houses and small office buildings and things of that nature. They set up law practice by renting one of his office buildings for their law firm. Booker Faison was a golfer. He liked playing golf, and he could not play at Terrell Park because he was black. And he brought his case to my dad and John's to sort of bring a case against the city of Beaumont to sue the city of Beaumont for not being able to play golf. And he did it along with five other black golfers who were all interested in playing out there. It was the first desegregation case here in Beaumont, and they won that case. And from winning that case, some other dominoes started to fall here in Beaumont also for African Americans. So between the two of them, the law firm of Johns and Willard desegregated everything that there was to desegregate here in Beaumont, Texas, starting with the parks, then the libraries, Lamar University, and finally, they went after the jobs. They went after the refineries and the jobs here in Beaumont, which is my father talks about that also. And if we get to that point, then I'll read something from his biography that he wrote, which really struck me in terms of why they decided to do that and how Johns and my dad played a crucial role in actually helping to bring about the black middle class here in Beaumont by filing those cases. So,
David, we got a little bit more minutes left. Can you share a little bit of with us about that particular event?
I can, and this is the part that I kind of knew a little bit about.
Because
But
I remember that time in the late '60s when they fought for jobs
yep,
and homes, mortgages for African American communities.
yes,
And as a kid, it didn't wasn't that important to me as it is today.
right.
And I enjoy the history. I enjoy the what they have accomplished, what they had to accomplish with.
They did. And so I'm going to let him speak on his behalf in regards to this. And this is what he said in this document that he wrote. After success had been achieved in the courts and through sit in demonstrations and marches, which also occurred here in Beaumont that a lot of people don't know about,
Right.
to acquire full citizenship rights for Black people in education and public and societal accommodations, I turned my attention to the economic arena. Cases were filed to prevent discrimination in employment of Black men at several of the area plants where they had been relegated to the quote unquote labor gangs and lowest paying jobs. Cases were filed by me and Mr. Johns against Jefferson Chemical Company, Texas U.S. Chemical Company, Goodrich and Goodyear Chemical Companies, Gulf States Utilities, um, Temple East Tex, and Bethlehem Steel, among others. All of these cases led to the um, the upgrading and promotion of the Black employees involved, as well as substantial awards for back pay. This quest for economic justice continues until this day. So you had Black men here in Beaumont because at that time they weren't hiring Black women to work in these plants. But of course, the number one job, employer in this area, still as it is today, were the chemical plants, the petrochemical plants, and things surrounding this area, by those companies. And you had black men who were qualified, many of them with college educations, who were relegated to what they called labor gangs, which
Hmm.
basically meant putting a broom in your hand and a mop in your hand and telling you to get out there and clean up and sweep up, after everything
Right.
was done. And so my dad and John's filed suit against every major employer in this area to make sure that these men were received qualified jobs due to their experience and due to their education. And not only did they win those cases and open up the doors for Black people to move up in the ranks, but they were also awarded back pay for the years that these men had been working there and had not received the due pay they should have been, given their experience and given their qualifications. So as I said, they in many ways effectively almost created the black middle class in this area, because those people then were able to get the pay that they deserved and were able to move their families and move up in terms of their income and their payment. So that's a tremendous thing that I think most people, and particularly people who work in these refineries and in these plants out here, need to know and probably don't know.
Right. I remember that very little bit of it. I remember I couldn't understand why my uncles and my relatives would go to Prairie View and Texas Southern and become engineer and come back to be only could be a school teacher,
Right.
or go and work in a game, be a game in the mobile oil. At that time, it was Magnolia Oil.
Yeah.
So your dad was a pillar in this community. He made a difference in the African American community, not just that, but in civil rights accomplishments. And 'cause we still have a long ways to go, but baby, tell you, he opened the door for us.
Yeah.
And I wanted to so much just kind of bring some history to him, because our generation do not know how hard it was, because when we grew up, we thought this is the way we supposed to live,
Yeah. Yeah.
and we didn't look outside the box because this was it, and we was satisfied, but it was more to it, and
Right.
your dad was a great big part of it, and I just had it on the back burner. On my desk and say, hey, I got Elmo Willard. We want to talk about the history of Elmo Willard, and because the people of Southeast Texas, Beaumont, Texas, Southeast Texas, need to know their history, need to understand that we have a history. I'm gonna add a little bit to it because I want to make sure that folks know that we have history. I want you, Dave, tell us about the route that we had here in Beaumont, Texas, and what your dad had to do to fight and fought for us to have our rights here in Beaumont, Texas.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, there was the main riot, where someone, of course, was accused of, raping or touching a white woman that turned into a huge affair, and Gordon Williams did a nice film, sort of a fictionalized film of that incident. Weirdly enough, I don't know about weirdly enough, but also the Willard family played a part in that. The Texas Rangers came down to quell that riot because there was days of bloodshed.
Right.
White people were just coming through these areas, coming through Gladys Street and the North End, just snatching up brothers, shooting, killing, the whole thing, as those kinds of things usually turned into. And so the Texas Rangers were coming to downtown to try to quell the riots and quiet things down. And they asked the city leaders, is there somewhere where we can set up shop when we get to town? And do you know, we need a family, or we need somebody that we can touch base with that has respect on both sides, the white and the black side. Is there anyone that we need to contact? And they said, yes, you need to contact Elmo Willard, and talking about my great grandfather at that time. And he's got a house there on Gladys Street. It's not too far from where all the riots and stuff were taken. And so, from what I heard as a kid and what Miss Seymour across the street, who lives across the street, Lula Seymour, has told me, this is where the Texas Rangers set up camp. Their horses were tied up here, and they used to sleep in the yard and sleep in the vestibule of this house. And then they would go out and try to quell the fights and the riots and the bloodshed that was taking place during the riots. So, so that was one thing. And then the other thing that really occurred that I'll kind of end with, I guess, because I imagine we're running short on time, is the desegregation of Lamar University.
Yes, we
When my
got time. We got time. We got
Okay.
time.
Well, that was, as you might imagine, a big thing. It was called Lamar College of Technology at the time. And there were some folks who, of course, wanted to attend Lamar, graduating from Hebert and graduating from Charlton Pollard, and were unable to go to Lamar. This was their school right here in their hometown.
Right,
And they were unable to attend it. So they meant they had to go either to Wiley or Prairie View or Fisk or wherever they could get into because they weren't allowed to go to Lamar. And so my dad and John's filed lawsuit against Lamar, and it became a crazy thing. Ed Sprott, who was a doctor and a member of the Sprott family here in Beaumont. He was the head of the NAACP at that time, and he worked really closely with Johns and my dad to sort of fight these segregation cases that they did. Mr. Sprott, Dr. Sprott, increased the numbers of African Americans in Jefferson County in the NAACP. I think when he took over presidency, there was something like maybe 20 or 30 people in the NAACP. He increased that number to, I think, to about 200 members at the time. He and my dad sort of plotted things out. They brought Thurgood Marshall here to Beaumont to speak and to kind of rally people behind what was taking place and the changes that were taking place. And just to be frank, white folks went crazy when they were filing this suit to go to and attend Lamar University. They blew up a bomb at the Sprott residence,
right,
the homestead, the Sprott homestead residence. They blew off a bomb there. Um, they stoned and tried to bomb the law offices of Johns and Willard there on Washington Boulevard. And the Ku Klux Klan burned a cross. They thought that it was my dad's house. It was actually the we lived in an apartment complex on Washington Boulevard that still stands today, but it's in really really bad repair. It's in bad shape. But the owners of the apartment complex lived in a very nice looking house that's also still there at the corner of Washington Boulevard and Palestine Street,
right,
and it was right next door to the apartment complex that we lived in. Well, the Ku Klux Klan, thinking that my dad was a lawyer, thought that we lived in the rental house, thought that we lived in the house owned by the people who owned the apartment building that we lived in. So they rode up one night and they burned a cross in front of the house and hollered and shouted and said if my dad didn't get out of town by next evening, by sundown, then they were coming back and they were going to lynch the entire family. And so I heard that story a lot as a kid. My dad sent my brother and I out to my grandmother's house on Plum Street, and my mother and my dad sat up all night with a shotgun waiting for the Ku Klux Klan to come back. And they didn't come back that night. Thank goodness for that. When they won the desegregation case for Lamar, Mr. Johns, Attorney Johns, escorted the first African American students to enroll on the day of registration, and they tried to overturn the car that they were riding in. They came up on campus, and white students and white protesters were out there, and they started rocking the car. They attacked the car and started rocking it and shaking it, and tried to overturn the automobile. And I think what happened was that I think some police escorted them out of the car, and they ended up running towards the registration building to get inside and try to register the student for classes. But it was a crazy time, man. It was I don't know how they. Sometimes I think back as to whether or not I'd be able to withstand all that stuff that they went through doing what they did. And I want to say that I would be able to because I'm raised that way, but you just never know, man. That stuff was crazy. It was
right. It was crazy, crazy. Then, and your dad, will be in our company, and we'll just sit there and lay and talk and laugh and joke, and I would listen to all his stories, but I never, uh, I never knew how serious we were. I mean, I just didn't take it at that time because he never really, uh, uh, because he was just a common guy, just big
Yep,
old common guy. And he would laugh and drink and have a
yep,
good time with you.
yep.
And it's just amazing how much he made a difference in our community.
He was
David,
never without a gun. My father
right,
was never without a
right.
pistol with him. And I used to hear stories about how they would win some cases. Sometimes they would have to try a case, up in the wooded areas or whatever, because they tried cases all over this area, and the verdict would come in. And he said that he and Johns would look at each other and just say, "I'll meet you at the car." Literally run out of the courthouse,
Right,
run into the car to try to,
right,
get away and stuff. So it was wild, man. They
wow,
did a lot. They risked their lives literally
right,
to
right,
make things better for people in this area. And I hope people appreciate it, and I hope they know this history and then pass
right.
it on to others.
This is why this is. I appreciate you, Dr. David Willard, as our guest tonight, and because we need to know our history, we need to know that it was right in our backyard, and so we can look forward to doing more for in our community, just like your dad, Elmo Willard, and Theodore Jones, and the two libraries are named after those two
Yep.
here in Beaumont, Texas, and it was so great to have you because you share some history to me that I did not know. I learned something. This is why I have this podcast, Knowledge is Power podcast, so that we can have learn and educate each other on our makeup. And also, I'd like everyone to join us on our Knowledge is Power 365 page that is on Facebook, where history of our Black history, Black culture posted every day, 365 days a year. Dr. David Willard, thank you so much for being our guest. And this was great, man. This was great, great history. Uh, the great pioneer leader of Beaumont, Texas, and Southeast Texas, Elmo Willard the third. Thank you so much, David.
Thank you
And
so
God
much,
bless you,
Tony.
man. And we got to do this again because I enjoy this. We'll do this again on Black History Month.
Anytime, man.
All right, guys.
Anytime.
Thank you so
Anytime.
much, and everybody. I thank you for joining us on Knowledge is Power Podcast Live. If you hear or hear our show or see our show, please share it with your friends, neighbors, and loved ones. Let them know that we're here to educate.
God bless everybody. Thank you,
God
guys.
bless you. All right.